Wishing you all a very happy morning. This is Vibha Dongre, lecturer, Department of Journalism, Kati Ashok Pai Memorial College, Shimoga. I would like to take this privilege to welcome you all to today's webinar on behalf of Kati Ashok Pai Memorial College and Manasa Center for Cultural Studies. Katir Ashok Pai Memorial College is a fledgling college started by Manasa Trust Shimoga in the year 2017. Late Dr. K. Ashok Pai was an internationally renowned community psychiatrist, writer, filmmaker, philanthropist, and a pioneer in the field of mental health. Katir Ashok Pai Memorial College started in the memory of this great visionary, and it aims to provide higher education in the field of psychology and humanities. It is in an attempt to build a healthier society. The Department of Journalism here is giving paramount importance to equip the students with high virtues and values. We understand the importance of equipping our students not only with knowledge from the curriculum, but also provide such kind of knowledge base and values to make them responsible and confident citizens for tomorrow. With regard to this, the department is regularly conducting seminars, workshops, outreach programs, and webinars till date with its sibling unit MCCS, that is Manasa Center for Cultural Studies, guiding the department in academics, research, and all other ventures. With this very brief and brisk introduction about the college and the department, I perceive that this is the right time to begin the virtual meet. I would like to shift the screen to Dr. Sandhya Kaveri, Principal, Kati Ashok Pai Memorial College, to deliver the welcome note. Madam, over to you.
Thank you, Vibha. Respected guests and participants, a warm good morning to all of you. At the outset, let me welcome you all to this national webinar on rethinking South India, cultural traditions and knowledge structures. This webinar is organized by the Department of Journalism of Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College, Shimoga. Being the principal of this college, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. The college offers BA in Psychology and Other Humanities, BSW course, and PG in Psychology. We have a well-equipped infrastructure and a band of committed staff. We have been organizing national level programs to enhance the academic and cultural talents of both the students and the staff members. We consider this webinar a unique one as we have with us a renowned scholar, critic, linguist, editor, educator, cultural activist, a writer, Professor Ganesh Devi sir. Apart from Lingua Facts, Prince Class, SARC, and Sahitya Academy Awards, he also is honored with the prestigious Padma Shri Award in 2014. Sir, it is my immense pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Manasa Trust and Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College, as well as all the delegates to this webinar to deliver special talk. Welcome you, sir. I feel privileged to welcome another eminent person, a historian, Sri Kalyan Kumar Chakravarti, as a special invitee. I welcome you, sir. Our ever-guiding scholar, Dr. Rajendra Chenni, who is the director of Manasa Center for Cultural Studies, is with us today. I welcome you, sir. I also welcome all the participants, and I appeal you to participate actively in this webinar. We feel honored to acknowledge the presence of our Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University, Professor Veerabhadrappa sir. Welcome you, sir. Renowned critics, writers, activists, scholars, all of you are there as delegates in this webinar. I welcome all of you to this platform. I extend a warm welcome to one and all. My heartfelt welcome to all media friends, our students, and our members of the staff who are the strength of this college. Once again, I welcome all of you to this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for the cordial note. Resuming the flow, we are overwhelmed to say that we have with us our esteemed guests of the day, Professor Ganesh Devi and Sri Kalyan K. Chakrabarti. We consider this as a privilege to introduce them to you all, for which I would like to invite two of my colleagues to make this moment. Firstly, I request Ms. Suvarchala Ambekar, lecturer, Department of BSW, to give the profile sketch of Professor Ganesh Devi, resource person of the day. Suvarchala, over to you.
Thank you, Vibha. Ganesh N. Devi is a thinker, cultural activist, and institution builder, best known for the People's Linguistic Survey of India and the Adivasi Academy created by him. He is credited with starting the Bhasha Research and Publication Center. He writes in three languages, Marathi, Gujarati, and English. His first full-length book in English after Amnesia in 1992 was hailed immediately upon its publication as a classic in literary theory. G.N. Devi was educated at Shivaji University, Kolhapur and the University of Leeds, UK. Among his many academic assignments, he held fellowships at Leeds University and Yale University and has been T.H.B. Simons Fellow from 1991 to 92 and Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow from 1994 to 96. He was a professor of English at the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. He gave up his academic career in order to initiate work with the denotified and nomadic tribes DNT and Adivasis. During this work, he created the Bhasha Research and Publication Center at Baroda, the Adivasi Academy at Tejgad, the DNT Rights Action Group, and several other initiatives. Later, he initiated the largest ever survey of languages in history, carried out with the help of nearly 3,000 volunteers and published in 50 multilingual volumes. In response to the growing intolerance and murders of several intellectuals in India, he launched the Dakshinayan southward movement of artists, writers, and intellectuals. In order to lead this movement and to initiate his work on mapping the world's linguistic diversity, he moved to Dharwad in 2016. Devi returned his Sahitya Academy Award on October 2015 as a mark of protest and in solidarity with other writers. Awards. G.N. Devi has received several Lifetime Achievement Awards. He was awarded Padma Shri on 26th January 2014 in recognition of his work with denotified and nomadic tribes and endangered languages. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in 1993 for After Amnesia and the SARC Writers Foundation Award in 2001 for his work with denotified tribals. He was given the reputed Prince Claus Award in 2003 for his work for the conservation of tribal arts and craft. His Marathi book Vanaprasth received 8 awards, including the Durga Bhagavat Memorial Award and the Maharashtra Foundation Award. He won the 2001 Lingvats Prize for his work for the preservation of linguistic diversity. Sir, it is our pleasure to have you with us today. Welcome you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Suvarchala. Now I call upon Mr. Manjunath Swami, HOD, Department of Social Work, Katil Ashokpai Memorial College, to introduce Mr. Kalyan K. Chakrabarti. Sir, please proceed.
Uh, Good morning, Vibha. Kalyan Kumar Chakravarti is an Indian historian, art historian, writer, anthropologist, academician, and administrator, known for his interculture and cross-disciplinary research and activism. a retired officer of an Indian administration service of in the batch of 1970. He was appointed chairman of the Lalita Kala Academy, India's Federal Fine Arts Academy in 2013. He has authored significant books on archaeology, rock arts history, tribal issues, museology, public policy, philosophy of religion, and art. He graduated with honors in history from Presidency University, Kolkata, and obtained his post-graduation degree in modern history from University of Kolkata. He joined the Indian Administrative Service IAS in 1970. While in service, he went on to acquire a graduate degree MPA in Public Administration from John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, 1985, and an AM 1987, and PhD in Fine Arts 1992 from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Science. The major milestones in his career are Indian Administration Service, member of government body Central University and Technology Management, Andhra Pradesh, Chancellor, National University of Educational Planning and Administration, Chairman, Lalita Kala Academy, New Delhi, 2013 to 2015, Member Secretary and Executive Trustee, India Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, New Delhi, Director General, National Museum, New Delhi, 2004 to 2006, Vice Chancellor, National Museum Institute, New Delhi. And honors and awards are Ford Foundation in the Asian Culture Council Fellowship, Harvard University, Khan Fellowship of the Asian Culture Council at Harvard University, Monsoon Fellowship at JFK School of Government, Harvard University, and Robbins Prize in the Indian Art Studies, Harvard University. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Without losing another minute, let us hear it from Professor Ganesh Devi, resource person of the day. Sir, Rethinking South India, Culture, Traditions and Knowledge Structures. Over to you, sir.
Dr. K.K. Chakravarti, former Vice Chancellor of NUPA, Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University, Principal of the Pai College, Director of the Pai Cultural Center. All of you very eminent persons, all faculty and students who have connected this morning for this discussion on the South. I want to thank all of you for showing interest in a discussion about what the South should mean today. In the times when the world is facing its unprecedented economic debacle, in the times when the globe is confronted with a definite ecological disaster, in the times when the political balance in so many countries is weighing in favor of the right and the extreme ultra-right, causing severe human rights violation, it is necessary for us to think what the South should mean, and it has meant to us so far, so that we can look for certain solutions. I have proposed for myself 3 issues related to this very large philosophical, historical, economic, ecological, sociological, and political spectrum, the South. I have proposed only 3 small subtopics of this very wide, bewildering spectrum. And those are, what have been the notions of the South in the past? how and who constituted South India, and finally, is that identity empowering or restrictive? What I'm going to present to you is a set of crude ideas in the hope that with discussion among ourselves, some of these ideas could be refined, some could be rejected, and some could be taken. I will begin now with a very common sense thought. When imagine yourself in the very primitive times, without the benefit of what we call civilization, what would be the sensory perception of time and space? In that imagined moment, I believe humans would have thought of the giver of energy, the giver of light, Surya, as a very important part of their daily life, and would have thought of the direction from which the Surya arises and the direction in which the sun sets as definitive borders or edges of the cosmos. And so it would be very natural for them to conceptualize, and I'm not saying that they invented these very words at that time, I'm using our contemporary terms, but they would have conceptualized the East as the East and the West as the West. But from where does the idea of South and the idea of North come in? And for that again, I would like to imagine the times after the very primitive times, and through those times, through long spans of thousands of years, humans would have noticed that a certain part of the year is colder than the remaining part of the year. And they would have noticed that the warmer part is distinct from the colder part of the year because there is an inflection in the movement of the sun. In other words, I am suggesting that despite not having chronometers, calendars, equipment, or antecedents, the humans would have imagined the south for the south and the north for the north, and if they were primarily situated, located in the northern hemisphere of the earth, they would have thought of the south as the giver of warmth, giver of light, giver of energy, and the north as colder climes. These ideas persisted. The east, the west, the north, and the south were conceptualized by humans, probably even before languages had developed to their full form. And that development came about around 70,000 years ago, but I will not get into the history of development of languages just now. However, despite knowing roughly where the south is and where the north is in relation to the east and the west, it was not very easy for humans to identify their exact location on the globe. And I said the exact location, just as you can today do that with the help of GPS. It was not possible for humans to identify their exact location on the globe until almost the 19th century. I would not myself have believed this Till I recently, for the purpose of this lecture, read about how the longitudes and the latitudes were finally determined. And the credit goes to a rather rustic watchmaker in Yorkshire, North England. And the year when this was done, much after the wall clocks with pendulums could be replaced with spring-driven clocks for the exactitude, for the exactness of time. This was done in the 1850s. Till then, the north was the north, the south, the east, the west, but the exact relationship of individuals, peoples, communities, civilizations with these directions allowed a fair degree of vagueness or ambivalence. And it is in that ambivalent world of directions, that a lot of ideas of what the South constitutes, what the North constitutes, got formed. I will turn to the ambivalent era of the Northing and the Southing in a few minutes' time. But before that, I would like to respond to a possible question that might emerge in your mind as you listen to what I said over the last few minutes. And that question could be that, is there not a definite cognitive mechanism in the brain which, whether a person is literate or illiterate, does not allow or does allow the human brain, that individual's brain, to determine the precise nature of directions? And in order to set aside that little doubt, I'm going to read out a page or so rather than speaking directly. The neurological work on recognizing exact directions had started at the beginning of the 19th century in Europe. But the credit for, I mention this more particularly because Dr. Ashok Pai's name is associated with the college. And Dr. Ashok Pai had an everlasting interest in psychology. And therefore, I had chosen this example. I read now. Historically, the credit for establishing the conceptual framework for clinical neuropsychology goes to the Yorkshire-born John Jackson, that is 1835 to 1911. My interest in his work was caused when I was working on a little book which was mentioned in my introduction on cultural amnesia. And that was at the University of Leeds. And in the history of University of Leeds, the very first doctorate was given to Jackson. So I got interested in the work of Dr. Jackson. Jackson was among the first to be given an honorary doctorate by the Leeds University. Among the varieties of neurological disorientation that Jackson identified, the one that fascinated me was navigation impairment. That is, while sailors are on the sea, they have a sense of loss of direction. Or if you were to go to the run of Kutch, you simply cannot identify which direction is which one. In medical terminology, this was called topographical agnosia. An individual afflicted by this agnosia, which in turn is a Greek word, meaning loss of knowledge, is found unable to remember the way to a destination known to him, so he may be able to recall important landmarks seen a long time ago. I mean, among the patients that Jackson studied were some women who knew where the London Tower was. They knew where the London Bridge was, but they did not know how to go there from their homes. So the little maps were forgotten. The larger maps were inscribed in the brain. In this case of agnosia, topographical agnosia, loss of direction. I got interested in this question of loss of direction because precisely at the time when I was working on my book at the University of Leeds, a very influential book had appeared in literary criticism. And that book was called Orientalism by Edward Said. And I'm sure many of you have read it or at least heard of it. By now, it is already an old classic. This question of Orient, and as against that, there has to be, for the word Orient to gain meaning, there has to be an antonym. So the antonym for Orient was Occident. How did Europe decide what is the Orient and what is the Occident? I mean, I think in 1880s, Rudyard Kipling had said the East is East, the West is West, the twin shall never meet until the sun shines on the empire. The idea of the Orient and the Occident, in opposition to that, had managed to combine the sense of the East with the sense of the South. The Orient was not just the East, it was not just the South, it was a clubbing together of the two. And that we accepted ourselves because of the colonial situation, the colonial frameworks of knowledge, the reality of knowledge domination during colonialism. And we accepted not just this topological agnosia, loss of direction or mismanagement of direction as a given, as acceptable idea. We also accepted with that, not very loudly, not very clearly, but tacitly, unconsciously, another very dangerous idea. And that dangerous idea came from a linguist who worked precisely the same time when Dr. Jackson was working on neurological disorientation, neurological deviations. This linguist was Arthur de Gobo. He had written a book titled, this was about the time when Charles Darwin was working on his theory of evolution. I mean, on the one side, we have a scientific theory of evolution coming up, or a scientific detection of neurological disorders coming up, and at the same time, a semi-scientific or anti-scientific belief mongering, stereotype mongering book was published in linguistics by de Gobo. It was called Inequality in the Human Races. Now, in that book, this linguist proposed that the ancestors of Indo-European languages were not just speakers of those languages, but a race, a slight shift from speaker to an imagined collectivity of speakers, and making that imagined collectivity as a race helped de Gobo to propose that this was a master race. And a little later, Karl Plenka, in the Homeland of the Aryans, in a German book, which was published in 1886, proposed that these superior people this master race had probably moved from Ireland, Northern Ireland, to South. The reason being, the German language has a Nordic ancestry. And so Karl Plenka was very keen to show that the superiority of the people speaking his language had to be given a geographical location, and building upon the earlier linguistic work, non-scientific linguistic work, Karl Plenka actually gave a homeland for this imagined, for this fictitious master race. And you know that these theories were subsequently used by Adolf Hitler, unquestioningly assuming that the master race of the pure Aryans. Please remember, this has nothing to do with India. The Aryans did not exist as a race or a group. This is all about understanding, perception of language behavior of our remote ancestors in the world. But Hitler used this theory and actually had plans of establishing a suzerainty, an empire of the master race, eliminating all others. And these all others were neither proposed by Plenka or de Gobineau. They were placed in the empty space, empty bracket by Adolf Hitler in his terribly, terribly violent book filled with violent ideas called Mein Kampf. And that was filled by Poles, Jews, Marxists, Gypsies, and practically, the transgenders, practically everybody that Hitler thought would come in his way of political realization of political ambitions. Why am I getting into that history while talking about South India? My answer to that question, I'm sure that question is bothering you because you came here to hear about South India and I'm talking about Germany. My answer to that question is that the theme of the imagined Aryans as a superior race, as a master race, also percolated in Indian discourse. First, through the works of, and this is somewhat, somewhat unsuspected, but I'm going to name first in the works of Annie Besant, who brought the idea of theosophy, one brand of theosophy, which had a little seed of the statement about the superiors, the ancients, those who live for 1,000 years. And of course, Tilak, who wrote a book called Orion, and the ancient home of the Aryans, establishing that this superior race had a trajectory from Scandinavia right up to India, and an initial essay by Sri Aurobindo also, from which, of course, Aurobindo and Annie Besant quickly distanced themselves from these ideas of fascist ideas. They very quickly distanced themselves. And one must appreciate it in their case by involving them in the popular struggle against the British. But the ideas lingered. And in the writings of B.S. Munje, V.D. Savarkar, K.B. Hedgewar, they remained for decades. And in a way, a competitive fascism emerged with two varieties. One variety of fascism in Germany with the idea of master race, and in India, a variety of fascism with the idea of master speakers, the Sanskrit speakers, those who brought Sanskrit to India, or probably because in that idea, the fascistic idea, Sanskrit does not come from outside, but it goes from India to outside. It's a historically unsubstantiated, wholly debatable and refutable idea of history. I have with me a thick book. I'm going to show it to you. It is by David Anthony, Horse. It is called The Horse, the Wheel and Language. And it's an extremely illuminating history of sprayed up languages in the ancient world from the time of Egypt, the ancient Egyptian civilization, to the time of the arrival and consolidation of the Indo-Aryan variety, that is not the Indo-European, not the Indo-Iranian, but the Indo-Aryan, that is Sanskrit language, as we recognize it as Sanskrit language. And this history clearly talks of the migrations from the north to the south and from the west to the east. And a combine of these migrations probably form the context for the idea of the Orient much later, much later. Now, all that I have said so far brings me to the question as to who decided that we are the South, and what has the South India been historically. Very briefly, to that second question, I can say that the history of human population in India, and Dr. Chakravarti is far more knowledgeable about this because he has studied rock paintings which go back for thousands of millenniums back in history. And we know that there has been a population in this subcontinent at least for 70 or 80,000 years. I am myself not a scholar of that, that discipline, but I am merely going by a new book published by David Drake. Who is a professor from the same university where Dr. Chakravarti did his researches, the Harvard University. He's from the School of Medicine. That is, David Drake is from the School of Medicine. And I am fully aware that genetics is not a discipline that a good historian or a social scientist should use, because it is far more often misused than used properly and judiciously. And yet, I would like to say that David Drake, on the basis of samples available in Hyderabad-based laboratory of CCMB, samples of ancient bones and skeletons have been collected and tested genetically, comes to the conclusion that there has been a migration from the south to the area where we have named the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilization. I am aware that the relationship between the pre-Dravidic language and the language of Indus Valley has not been established conclusively. It is debatable. It is neither established nor refuted. And that research is going to take us a long time because there are not enough samples available in the Indus Valley for us to come to a full and irrefutable conclusion about this. So I will not build any hypothesis on that basis, but the migration from the south to the north is known. It is also known in the history of rice, that is akki, seeds, the chawal, that the cultivation of rice was seen in the south just as it was seen in the north. It was also seen in the Indus Valley, and we can have a history of that cultivation at least for 6,000 or 7,000 years without any significant doubt about that history. What I'm saying is, did people in the south exist before the known history of the Tamil language? The known history of the Tamil language is probably 2,500 years. We do not know enough or much, or probably not much at all, about the pre-history of that language group. But does that mean that there was no human civilization here? The answer is very clearly and loudly, no, that's wrong. There has been a civilization in pre-Tamilian period as well, and probably, in all caps I'm saying probably, it is much older than the civilization that emerged this north of Narmada, north of Vindhyas. Please think of this. Now, if that is the case, then is the mythological definition of the South, which gained currency after the 1st century AD, after Vyasa had consolidated the mythology primarily related to the Vedic past and the pre-Vedic past of migrations from Amanya through Iran, through the steppes to Punjab and central India. That is a long period of nearly 2,000 years. Mythology related to that, compressed history of that period became mythology for Sanskrit world of knowledge, and Mahabharata of Vyasa consolidated that. And in that mythology, there is a little story of Agastya having gone to the south, and another story of Parshuram being there. Are these myths to be accepted by us as our foundational myths in the face of great scientific evidence which is coming our way in archaeology, in biological sciences, in linguistics, in plant sciences? Do we get defined as myth defines us, or do we define ourselves as sciences help us in defining ourselves? That's a question for you to consider and decide. I want to now move to another question, and that is the doing of the South. As I look at the South of the Vindhyas, which includes Maharashtra, which includes probably Chhattisgarh also, the Gondi speaking people, up to Kerala. As I look at history as it is reported, unfortunately there is no consolidated single historical work, single place historical work on the history of the south of India. Most of the history that we have all looks back to the Sanskrit language, and then the Vedas, Upanishads, as if the south did not exist. In the history that I see, I notice a very strange trend. I may be wrong, but I would like to. I mean, I'm not claiming that all that I say is correct. These are hypotheses, but I would like to present before you this idea And the idea is probably the South has done much earlier everything than the North, that everything is done by the North later. For instance, the Bhakti movement. While the last Bhakti poet, last generation of Bhakti poets in the North is in the 17th century, and its high tide is in the rise of Sikhism, Sufism, Mira and Kabir a few centuries earlier, Bhakti as a challenge to the orthodox worldview, defending the Brahman as that alone, that and nothing outside it. That formula, that which is not you alone, that there is nothing outside this. The Brahman envelops everything. Challenging that, the first wave is seen in the Alwar poets, the Nayanars, and that goes back to 6th and 7th century. So while the North is working on the Bhakti resistance to Hindu orthodox, not Hindu orthodoxy, theological orthodoxy, in the second millennium, that is from the 11th century to the 17th century, the South has done it all at least a few centuries or even a millennium earlier. Basveshwar, Akkama Devi emerged in Karnataka much earlier than Eknath and Tukaram emerged in Maharashtra, or further north, the Bhakti poets, the Dasa poets emerge. This is one example, but there are many, and that is the buildings of towns, the rise of the city culture, the rise of the city with the temple at its heart. Once again, you find in the southern part of India, south of the Vindhyas. If you like to look at the transition from the Varna to caste, you know, all of you have read, I hope you read it. If you are not read it, do read it. Dr. Ambedkar's great work, Annihilation of Caste, and how the transition from the Varna to the caste marks a very important shift in the composition, constitution of Indian society, because Varna and caste are not all at one. Varna is the first layer, then comes the caste, complicated caste due to economic reasons, undesirable though. That shift seems to have happened in the South much earlier than it seems to have taken place in the North. And it's the same with the progressive thought. Practically every socially progressive thought, I'm not saying all, there are very many honorable exceptions. This is a broad generalization, but it seems to emerge from the South. Whether it is Periyar, Ambedkar, Basavanna, Phule, Narayan Guru, you name them, and there's no shortage of that. But that is slightly external reference that I'm making to the identity, but an internal reference to the identity can be defined, recognized, if we look at the formations of the kingdoms in the South. Whether whether it is the Hampi Empire, Vijayanagar Empire, or you can go even to an earlier time, or the Nizam's territory, or Shivaji's work extending up to Tanjore, or the rise of Mysore, or you think of let's say Travancore, you will notice one peculiar thing, that is none of those kingdoms had territory a map which coincides with map of any given state in the south today. All those maps had several states put together. It was what is Karnataka today and what is Telangana, parts together, or what is Kerala today and Tamil Nadu, parts together, or what is Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, parts together. And therefore, in the south, people have been absolutely, essentially bilingual forever. It is the river politics which has kept us divided since independence. River water disputes are not solved so that the south remains desperate, separate. I will now come to the concluding part of my thoughts. Despite having the best scientists and the best artists and the best writers and the best sports people, and despite contributing a very large part of this nation's revenue, the South has never been able to dream of sending a Prime Minister of India to Delhi. With one very rare accidental case of Mr. Deve Gowda. And if I were to ask you privately, would that be possible any time in future? Your answer will be, it is difficult because the numbers are against the South. But when I think of Vindhyas down to Kerala, if there were an understanding of the South as the giver to India and not a benefactor, South as the prime mover for the benefit of India, and if there were a good understanding among the people and the political forces, the South can challenge the imposition of this UP-Bihar belt on Indian politics, therefore Indian legislation, the destiny of India. Today, you are reading that in Tamil Nadu an anti-Hindi agitation is brewing up. I love the Hindi language. I love all languages. I love Kannada, Tamil, Marathi, Hindi, Gujarati. I'm a lover of languages. And I do not like language to be an instrument for political division. However, if we were to sit together and think of the minorities in India, we will notice that the largest minority in India is not Muslims or Christians, religious minorities. Largest minority is not tribals or denotified people. Largest minority is linguistic minority. We together, south of India, form that minority. And that minority put together can counter the imposition of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan equation, which is a child, unfortunate progeny of what I described earlier in the history of Europe and its remnants in Indian political thought, now erupting in a big way, in a sick way, and trying to dominate India's mind and the idea of India, so that India enters an era of darkness again. I think we need to look at this question of the South, not just being South Indians, but as being pro-democratic, pro-constitution people. How that question was played in Europe, played out in Europe, how its later day incarnation is confronting our country, are some of the questions that we should look at, rather than just thinking of ourselves as Karnataka people, Tamil Nadu people, Telangana people, Maharashtra people, Kerala people. I have done my work. This whole chain of thought has been in my mind ever since I read Orientalism, and ever since I have been wondering as to why we could not create a fitting complement or a counter argument to advertise Orientalism. Thank you very much. What I said is very disturbing, I am aware, but these are thoughts put before you so that you can reject them, refute them, and I can reform my thoughts more scientifically, more systematically. I want to thank you for your great patience with me. I am done.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. That was really a worth listening session. I must say it was truly a linguistic journey through what we call as psychology, politics, mythology, history, and so many other junctures. I really hope that we will be having a thoughtful interaction session later, before which I would like to acknowledge the presence of Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University, Professor V.P. Veerbhadrappa sir. Sir, I heartily welcome you and heartily welcome you, sir. And resuming the flow, it is my turn to request Professor Mr. Kalyan K. Chakrabarti sir to reflect on the resource person's speech. Later, which I will request later Kalyan gives speech. I request Vice Chancellor sir to proceed. Now it is time to request Kalyan Chakrabarti sir to reflect on the speech of the resource person. Thank you. Kalyan sir, over to you.
Okay, so you see, I was listening to Dr. Devi. I could realize that I am in Shivamogga, where on the bank of Tungabhadra, Akka Mahadevi, the great votary of Parashiva, and the great harbinger of female emancipation existed, and who began the discussion in Sambhava Mandapa. And when I was listening to Dr. Devi's explanation about the loss of navigational direction and about neurological disorientation, I also recalled Dr. Ashok Pai's Manamanthana, in which he speaks about Agatha, trauma. So I am also trying to be moving in the footsteps of the Kuvempu, who asked everybody to unhouse their soul. O Nanna Chetana, Aguni Aniketana. Unhouse my soul. Only the infinite is your goal. He was talking about rising above caste, religion, gender, and language for graduating to the status of Vishwamanava. He calls out today to the parochial minority of rulers sitting in Delhi to become Anikatana again, to rise above divisive games, and then instead of using Rama to sow hatred, Kuvempu hailed him as the prophet of Sarvodaya. He also extolled the farmer as the Aluva Yogi, the tiller saint, and asked for egalitarian development to provide equal share and life to all. Sarvarige Samapalu, Sarvarige Samabalu. Now, when we are talking about history, we are not talking about a north-south divide. We are talking about the spirit of the South, the mission of the South. We are talking about a mission which is cast on the shoulder of the South to unite all the states, both in the North and the South, East and the West, against a conspiratorial elite is trying to destroy the basis of cooperative federalism and replace it with unitary autocracy. And if it had done it with some good governance, it would have been okay. But it is bad governance of the ultimate kind. So the South can also help there, both the North and the South and the East and the West. Because what it is I see, when Dr. Devi was talking about Orientalism, I see a new colonial conspiracy emerging, an attempt to divide and rule in the same way as the British were trying to divide and rule. In fact, this is a direct borrowing of a page from the colonial book. So it is this conspiracy of using nationalist rhetoric for anti-nationalist aims, of using and misusing the rhetoric of tradition to divide the nation, a tradition which has been custodially preserved by the South for thousands of years, that the South has to guard against. And when Dr. Devi was also talking about the prehistory of language, and we had discussed for one day this genetic and paleontological evidence. Now these theories of diffusionism and migration are long dead. Scientists all over the world are not talking about diffusion from any particular center, but a multilinear evolution. And to use, genetic and paleontological evidence dispersed here and there to piece their story and to build up a racial theory is a preoccupation of fascism. Certainly, the South and the North are not going to fall prey to that kind of thing. So when we look at the scenario today, since I have administered for a long time, I only see a record fiscal deficit, a growing public debt, a balance sheet crisis, explosion in unemployment, a growing gap between a few favored rich, corporate rich, and the deluded poor, fed on a diet of fictitious nationalism and religiosity, not with good governance or with ecological well-being or with diffusion of prosperity. When one talks about the language, in fact, the established evidence is that the agglutinative South Indian language has much greater impact on the North than the inflectional North Indian languages on the South. But it is not a question of insular patriotism, original patriotism. It is obviously a fusion of languages of culture, and the South especially, because it has kept a hold on Sanskrit, on family values, on tradition, to a much greater extent than the North, which has been subject to many invasions, many depredations, lot of slaughter. The South is still today in a custodial position of the Indian tradition, which is under heavy assault in the North, has been under heavy assault in the North. In fact, talking about Rama himself, we know that there are Ramayanas all over, and Rama had traveled through, as Dr. Devi said, even Chhattisgarh. This was part of Dakshina Patha. It was this Dandakaranya through which he traveled. That Dandakaranya today is subject to predatory assaults of corporates like Adani, who have destroyed thousands of acres of forest. In fact, when I was moving there, I found that 3,000 trucks were moving in a day to destroy some of the densest forests. And it was only the injury to a child which forced the district magistrate to give a 3-hour break in that movement. So, in the name of ecology, we are destroying the forests through which Rama traveled with his family. And then, whether it is Dandakaranya, or Bhadrachalam, Kishkinda, Anegundi, Amesharam, Dhanushkodi, the entire movement of Rama to the south was through hills and dells, bluffs and spurs. And the Ramayana was also dispersed from India to South and Southeast Asia. And the Ramakian traditions are there all over. And we have the Shiva Buddha cults and the Devaraja cults, which have also spread from India. Now, nobody is talking about this fact that in order to give worship, again, am I audible? Again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
I'm audible, okay. So, again, there is this great problem that one uses the name of Rama to destroy Rama's retreats and his routes and his destinations and his many regional and variations to which he lives all over Southeast Asia, Northeast India, South India, North India, East India, everywhere he is there. So obviously, there is a problem here of trying to create a Radha. And if we do a little bit of Manamanthana, we will see that we are being misled and deluded. And then when one looks at the Sthala Puranas of all the temples, the Sthapatis of Mahabalipuram, the Kashyapa Silpa Samhita, for instance, I got it translated into 45 sculptures using local sculptors and iconometricians in Bangalore. Dr. Shekhar was with me in those days. And then what you find is that all these texts, Mayamata, Manasara, Ishana Seva, Gurudeva Paddhati, they were all born in the south. And in the south, there was a confluence, I mean, in Karnataka music. In the south, in the Vesara temple, there was a convergence of the Karnataka, Dravida, and the Latina, Kutina modes. The south was always for confluence and convergence. That is visible in music, that is visible in the arts, that is visible in the architecture. And when we look at the great dancer Bala Saraswati, who was comparing recital with a temple, and she was talking about how one moves from Alaripu through Jatiswaram, through Shabdam, to Varnam, and to Padam, and then Tillana. There is a gradual sense of self-fulfillment, of movement from lot of music, lot of melody, lot of meter, to meaning without meter. It is this sense of graduation, this sense of great communion between the soul and the oversoul, which have animated Karaikal Ammayar, Andal, Akka Mahadevi, and others. And then there have been women warriors too. We know about Abhaya Tuluva Queen, Abakka Chauta of Tulunadu. We know about the Kakatiya monarch, Rudama Devi. We know about the mother goddesses, Jakamma, Mariamma, Satalamma, who have been worshipped. We know about Draupadi, Amma, who is worshipped by depressed classes in much of the south. And Akka Mahadevi herself, who talks like that she is like a silkworm, weaving her house with love from her marrow and dyeing in her body's threads, burning, worshipping the Lord, white as jasmine. We have this sense of evocation of a great movement of spirituality, which is as intense as anything could be, which pervaded the south and which moved from the south to the north. Whether it is Shankaracharya, I mean, with all his buds, whether it is the great Vidyaranya, who brought all the philosophies together in Sarva Darshana Sangraha, whether it is the other great scholars and devotees like Vallabhacharya and Ramanujacharya or Madhacharya, they were all from the south, which is not to say that south should claim a monopoly of devotion, or that, but then it is again the south which had carried on the Vedic consciousness, which is claimed to be a monopoly by some people who think that they are elite. It is the South which had kept this Vedantic consciousness, Vedic consciousness alive. And when I was looking for the Vedic recitative traditions, I could locate them only in the South. And there are entire villages which are speaking Sanskrit. And when Dr. Devi was surveying these 780 languages, oral languages, we should remember that this vast body of orality, which he was trying to tap in a quick rural appraisal, still remains to be understood and tapped for building up our history. When Dr. Devi was talking about rock art, he was also talking about the cognitive beginnings of humanity. I mean, a 100,000-year-old rock art site has been found in Bhimbetka, and it has been internationally acknowledged as the oldest site in the world. I mean, will be in the Mesolithic layer, cemented by a calcite layer. And so in the south, there are thousands of sites, both petroglyphs and pictographs, which remain unread and unstudied. Who has read the history of this country? I mean, some of it is contextual and oral, and much of it is not studied archaeologically. In spite of all the investigations that have been going on, I mean, in Hunsgi, Malabar valleys, Kaladi and Bhima basins, and whatever the contacts that are being traced between Neolithic and nomadic sheepgoat pastoralism, I have been reading about all that. And the Kurubas of Karnataka, Golas of Andhra, they still retain some of those ancient practices. But the ethno-archaeology or the cognitive archaeology still remains to be undertaken. And it is really the scholarship of the South who should come to the rescue. And it is the South again which has kept up the traditions of scholarship and learning in the various mutts. When I was working with the Gurubayur mutts, the Nagarathar mutts, they could assemble 80 villages. I mean, and we didn't pay for it. They just assembled and worked for us. And they were all associated with the temples. And there are potters, barbers, washermen, carcass handlers who have been putting together images or building a sacrifice or creating a musical score or a procession. So this great movement in the South, which has been shared by all castes and all groups, it is not to be attributed to any particular caste or varna or anybody. And when we look at the Chola, Chera, Pandya maritime trade, the Pumpuhar, you see, the Masula boats and the other boats, the great tradition of maritime trade from the south, then when you look at the present policy of looking west rather than east, then you understand how there is a failure. I mean, which in our policy, in looking west rather than east. Why should we build walls for another Western president when there is so much to be done in Southeast Asia, Central Asia? So it is very vital that the South Indian states, they do not see this as a South Indian mission. This is an Indian mission. It is for them to revive, you see, the Indian tradition with their hold on scholarship, their hold on Sanskrit, their hold on Indological investigations, their hold on good governance. Uttara Mayur inscription in Tamil Nadu, long before devolution of power to panchayats. We have an entire inscription giving the details of governance. So how this is to be done. And at present, when you see that the small group of predatory individuals are trying to free themselves of all instruments of audit, electoral, judicial, or parliamentary scrutiny, and who are, you see, into non-governance or into misgovernance. Look at COVID. I mean, you know, today, when we are destroying the forests and we are giving ex post facto clearance for violations of environmental law, we should remember that the COVID-19 has spread only in those areas which are unforested, which are heavily industrialized, which are heavily urbanized, where we have destroyed the minor forest produce economy. So therefore, when we are looking at the medical record, most of the testing samples, most of the intensive care units and the protective gear are from the south. And whether it is the infant or maternal mortality rates, population growth rates, fertility rates among women, they are lower in the south. Life expectancy rates and literacy rates are higher in the south. Gender ratio is better in the south. So the much hyped projects of the central elite, like digital, smart, startup, skill, or make in India, they have only sharpened urban and rural disparities. They are meant for India, mind you, not for Bharat. And it is this Bharat for which the South has to unite all the states of the North and the South, East and the West. And it is not to be an insular, South-oriented, indrawn, retrograde movement. The South has the responsibility and the mission to salvage. I mean, I recall Thoni Appar, the Lord of Shiali, the Lord of the boat, who, like Noah with his ark, was trying to salvage everything from the deluges by putting the best and the finest in the boat. It is the responsibility of the South to imitate that great act and renew that mission again. Thank you.
Well, dear friends, I think all of you will agree that we have listened to two of the most brilliant analysis of what South has been and the way in which we should negotiate with the legacy of the South and how these resources can be put together to, in a way, bring the future of India on the right direction without being insular or parochial. I would like to thank both the scholars before we enter into a discussion with the delegates, and I'm glad to inform the two scholars that these two talks have been listened to very intensely by a large number of scholars from Karnataka and outside. There's one small announcement I would like to make. Our Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University, Professor Veerbhadrappa, was with us all the time. And since he has to attend another video conference, he has asked me to read out his message. He says that Kuvempu University has greatly benefited from the national webinar, which focused on a discovery or the rediscovery of the South. We are glad that much of the work in the area of research being done in Kuvempu University is very much in line with the discovery of the native and the regional resources. On behalf of Kuvempu University, I would like to compliment the organizers and also the two stalwarts who were able to spare their time for us. This is the message that Professor Veerbhadrappa, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kuvempu University, has given us. We thank him. And now it is over to Vibha Dongre to conduct the discussion session.
Thank you, sir. So the now is session open for discussion. I request Ganesh Devi, sir, Professor Ganesh Devi, sir, to unmute the audio to answer the questions. And I will read out the questions. For you. Professor Ganesh Devi, sir, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Rajaram Tolpadi has asked the question. The idea of Aryan superiority, Arya Samaj appears to be the great votary of a variety of racism that you were talking. Please comment on it.
Well, this Aryan supremacy looked to me in the 1960s as only a story associated with Hitler's, legacy. In the 80s, I thought this was a bygone, because we were talking about people who were marginalized, trying to bring them to the foreground then. But today, when I read the new education policy, or I look at the CAA, I look at attitudes to Kashmir, to minority, to nomadic people, I find that it is no longer an academic issue, but an existential issue. Please think of Anand Teltumde. Think of the students in the JNU, students in Jamia, Jadavpur. Think of what happened to Vemula. Think of the Kalburgis and the Gauri Lankeshes over the last few years. That idea of Aryan supremacy, whatever its history, right, wrong, ridiculous, hilarious, tantalizing, whatever be the past, in the present, we are forced into a moment where we have to fight it. I think it is from that angle that I am looking at it. There have been, when I look at the 19th century thinkers, many of them had a shade of this in their thought. They were working within their time frame. They were responding to their realities, their compulsions. I will present a slightly similar question. When we think of Mahatma Gandhi, we know that in the early part of his life, he did not think of religion as a dividing factor, as a great thing to worry about, but later he changed his views. And so, I will not get into what Gandhi thought about in his early part, or what Ambedkar thought about Muslims before he turned to Buddhism. I will only say that Ambedkar brought to us a very fine concept of the constitution. Gandhi brought to us a very fine instrument of struggle against injustice. And I'll put all my mental and physical energy in fighting the evil which is surrounding us. So that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There is another question. How can political imposition of North be defeated? How can political imposition of the North be defeated?
The human history is very inspiring in that direction, because all kinds of such imposition was defeated in the past, and the humans have been continuously evolving. You please think of the years from 1937 to 1945, and a moment had come in France when the French president had to give his lecture to the nation from a British radio station. But the tide turned. The tide turned. Similarly, you please think of 1926 to 28, those years when the Indian National Congress of that time was thinking of passing a resolution for complete independence, Purna Azadi, Sampurna Swatantriya. It looked difficult at that time. But in 20 years' time, which is not a long time, that was a reality. How can imposition be fought? As a simple common sense answer, and that is, there have to be fighters who do that fight, who make that fight their own, who make that as their mission. And the other part of the answer, which history teaches us, is to gather the local resources, as Tagore did in his Bengal and Gandhi did in his Gujarat in their time, to gather local resources and to humanize those resources, modernize those resources, and put them to use. When I was choosing this topic, the South, I was constantly thinking of a very great Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, who has a book of poems called The South. And I wish, if it is already not done, a translation of Seamus Heaney's South and Thomas Kinsella and Seamus Heaney, those two Irish poets, the translations of their poems should appear in Kannada. They're very inspiring, and they have all the elements that we need today as our mantra for gathering ourselves, for rising again, and thinking of a politics of togetherness. The politics of togetherness, not the politics of separation. Politics of togetherness is what will help us today. And the South has, as Dr. Chakravarti so beautifully put before us, the South has the legacy of this politics of togetherness for over 1500 to 2000 years. We should gather that legacy, articulate it again, use it as an instrument of fight. And India is waiting for us. It is for our India that we should fight as the South, not for separation from India. That is not the idea. I will be the last person to support that idea. It is as Indians, but being South, which is part of our identity primarily, we should work. Thank you. And not by using some worn out ideas. The ideas of Marx are great, but they had their day. The ideas of Lohi are great, but they had their day. We have to invent once again new terminology, new ideas, new manner of action, new manner of thought. And that alone will free us. As Gandhi said in his Hind Swaraj, be free within yourself, and then the rest of the world be free.
Thank you, sir. Next question goes this way. Even in narratives about independence, the South has been largely marginalized. So, contemporary history taught in schools is misleading. Your comments, please.
Well, the question has the answer for it. The question states the answer for it. So I don't think I need to elaborate on that. Whoever put that question precisely knows what the answer is. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, how will the NEP affect this power equation between the South and North?
You see, the first is this topological agnosia. I said the mix-up of the directions must be cleared. Today, the South all over the world means the poor, the underprivileged, the dispossessed. And in the times of the world's greatest economic debacle, we must all learn the politics of togetherness so that all of us are together. Let's forget caste, religion, trade, occupation. I am an academic. How can I go to the street kind of shyness? We must all come together where asamanta, inequality is hurting us. Now, where is the inequality hurting? It is hurting the migratory laborer because they do not have equal rights, it seems. It is hurting the tribals and the nomadic community because they don't have equal human rights even today. It is hurting students today because of the new education policy which is promoting inequality. It is hurting women because of the social structure. So women, students, laborers, workers' unions, all must come together in the politics of togetherness to fight inequality, because the South stands for equality in the global terminology, and the North stands for monopoly, domination, appropriation. We are in the global South. Our numbers are out of 9 billion people. The global South consists of 6 billion. The middle cadres, probably 2 billions. Only 1 billion are on the side of the North, economic North. So we should think of the South economically, ecologically, and culturally all together for the benefit of humanity and for the benefit of our country.
Thank you, sir. Here is a question for Chakrabarti, sir. Chakrabarti, sir, are you able to hear me?
Dr. Chakrabarti, is a question for you. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, have you unmuted?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here.
The question goes this way. Could you elaborate on movement of thought from South to North, especially thoughts about secularism?
Will you repeat it again? What is it?
Okay. Could you elaborate on movement of thought from South to North, especially thoughts about secularism?
Secularism. Okay. Well, to me, secularism is equal respect for all persuasions, all religions, all aspects of thought. Now, you look at the Mahamaham festival in Kumbhakonam, in which the 9 rivers you see assemble, and they are both from the north and from the south. And even in the recent history, I mean, whether it is Ramana Maharshi or the first and last freedom theory of immeasurable love of Krishnamurti, or Satta Sai, reason and intuition. You see, this entire approach of confluence of Nishyasa and Abhudaya, of material and spiritual well-being, has always been effectively practiced by the South and taken to the North. And this entire Vedantic consciousness, Vedic consciousness, which it is much vaunted, you see, supposed to be a legacy from the North or the Aryans is absolutely the exclusive position today of the South Indian, intellectual and spiritual elite. And it is they who are carrying it forward and who have kept it alive. And it is that sense of, convergence of all persuasions and thoughts that South is even today carrying to the North. But to me, much more important than a mere secularism in persuasions is an approach to a kind of a secular approach to governance. I mean, I appear to be diverging, but I mean, what I am talking about, the South uniting with the North to basically deal with a small predatory elite, which by combing together is coalition, I mean, is pretending to be in the majority. To deal with that, by uniting with all the states, by sinking all the differences, the apparent divides, political divides. But the real divide should be lack of compensation, for instance, for demonetization, GST, or the lack of compensation for dealing with the pandemic or with the migration. Much of the migration has been absorbed by the South Indian states. And it is this subsidization of the North by the South economically, because in population terms, the decision of the Finance Commission to take the 2011 than 1971 census as the criterion put the burden on the South or on the states. So unless secularism is reread in terms not of religion, but in terms of, what shall I say, being discriminated against and subsidizing both the North and the South, not only financially now, but also intellectually, spiritually, and otherwise, we won't understand the true meaning of secularism today in the new context. It can, you see, this is a diversion. I mean, trying to talk about religion all the time, trying to talk about Hinduism all the time, not concentrating on the real issues, which really bother the states, which really bother the poor, which, when these vast group of migrants, I mean, they were traveling, so many of them have died. So many died in the demonetization. So many have committed suicide. Nobody is talking about them. While we are raising walls for an Western president, this is what was happening in this our part of the world. So secularism means, according to me, no longer just an indifferentism towards religion, but a kind of an inclusive approach for the entire country, which is to be led by the South for resisting, you see, the predatory assaults of a small minority of people who have hijacked the machinery of the state.
The question goes this way: should mobilizational politics step out of identity politics?
See, it is identity politics. Mobilization is a set pattern all over the world. When there was struggle in South Africa, the apartheid, or in the United States, the struggle between the black and the white, there has been identity struggle in Sri Lanka, which became very violent, we know. But there can be a slightly different kind of identity politics, and that is by getting to understand your identity better. The only analogy for this is the women's struggle all over the world. They are not against a particular government, but they are trying to bring a greater self-awareness about the gender place, gender rights, gender relations. So I'm proposing an identity struggle of that kind. It is deeply political because it will ensure equality for a much longer time than a short-term identity politics aimed at one or the other election can. I think my plea is for the South to understand the South the way it is South and to articulate it in the language of the South and also the idiom of the South and the languages of the South. That's a pending work. And as you know, Albert Camus said, if you do not define yourself, the others will. So the South is allowing the others to define itself. To change that is deeply political. That's all that I'm suggesting. It's a huge task. It will take several decades, but a beginning has to be made somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Here is another question. Sir, what is your thought on one nation, one language? I feel it is not democratic.
It is a stupid thought. Absolutely stupid. Absolutely, it's an insult to me. It's an insult to India. It's an insult to speakers. There is absolutely no need for any nation to have one language. It can have one language, it can have 10 languages, it can have 10,000 languages. That has nothing to do with nation. Nation is an idea of bringing greater justice to the people that reside in that nation. And in terms of justice for the people, if people speak more languages, that nation should allow more languages. If people in the nation belong to more religions than one, then that nation should allow equal dignity to all religions. If it has more ethnic groups than one, that nation should allow dignity and respect for all ethnic groups. The idea of nation is focused in the idea of justice for the people that constitute the nation. If the idea of justice dies there, then nation will become a prison. I don't want to live in a prison. I want to live in a nation. So one language, one nation, one language is an absolutely stupid idea with all letters in big capitals. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. At the time constraints, we are also running out of the time. Now, I request Dr. Rajendra Chenni, sir, who is actually reason behind this webinar. I would like to invite him to give the concluding remarks. Chenni, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Viva. So, we have listened to two very persuasive, multi-pronged, highly sensitive presentations on how to recover the past. I believe these two presentations made today, if the content of the presentations and the discussion is made known to a larger body of scholars, should begin a counter-narrative in the field of history. Because in recent times, rediscovery of the past has been fraught with unacceptable ideological positions. In fact, one could say that history as a discipline has been a major victim of the politics that we have been experiencing, not only in India, but elsewhere. Therefore, the two presentations today, they should help us in starting a very different kind of intellectual inquiry, where we are returning to the past of the South only to understand it as a living present. It also requires, as it was demonstrated by the two speakers today, not only a multidisciplinary creation and application of knowledge, I would say it also requires a very honest probing into how we came to be and how this nation existed in history as a multilingual, a multi-religious, a multicultural entity or a phenomenon which cannot be compared to anything similar anywhere in the globe. Now the question is, how was this coexistence possible? The thrust of the two presentations has been on this extraordinary resilience and ability of the South to sustain coexistence of a plurality which is so huge, so heterogeneous, that it defeats the human imagination. How was this possible? What were the intellectual resources that the South possessed in the first place to create space for all these ways of life, ways of thinking, cosmological imaginations, cultural production, linguistic diversity? So I believe that if at all a healthy trend has to begin in the reconstruction of history, it should not be in the direction of nostalgic glorification of the past. The two speakers have been very emphatic that they are not advocating insularity of the South, which would be anti-historical and ahistorical. They have emphasized the fact that the South has been a giver of thoughts, a giver of philosophies, and a giver of all those forces which can sustain a unique entity called the Indian nation. I believe this process involves, as it was again demonstrated today, the deconstruction of these received opinions, even from the highly respected scholarly disciplines and fields of inquiry, which have marginalized the South or which have given a narrative which does not match with the facts of history. Therefore, if at all there is a return to the past of the South, if at all there is an intellectual enterprise beginning now to understand what the real South was, I'm sure the roots of this enterprise were found very adequately, very substantially in the two presentations. And one need not put the politics behind this under the carpet. It's not necessary, especially in the highly challenging and difficult times that we are going through. There should be clarity that this process of understanding history cannot be isolated from our enterprise of trying to find the right politics for the people, for the masses of people, for the communities who have in the first place created India. Therefore, this webinar today with the two brilliant presentations showed us the direction. It has opened out new horizons where it's not a question of taking sides with a certain kind of a politics. As Dr. K.K. Chakravarti put it very beautifully, what we should be talking about is not secularism with reference to religions, but secularism of how we live and how we govern ourselves. And this understanding is very vitally and closely related to the understanding of all the indigenous systems of knowledge we had, the huge amount of human experience contained in our history and then embodied in our languages and culture. So without any exaggeration, and not because I'm one of the organizers, I believe this was one of the most seminal academic and intellectual sessions that I have listened to. It was extremely educative, and I would like to thank the two great scholars and one of the things we say in Malnad is, Matebadi, come back again because we need you, because we need to talk to you and listen to you. So with those words, I thank Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College for organizing this webinar, and all the participants who listened to these two great presentations. Thank you, Professor Ganesh Devi. Thank you, Chakraborty sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, sir, for that right reflection of the purpose. With that, we are here at the end of the greatly insightful or intellectual webinar. Before I finally wrap it up, I would take this privilege to express my sincere gratitude, firstly to Professor Ganesh Devi for invoking a new perception amongst us and actually making us to rethink about the South. Thank you, sir. Secondly, Mr. Kalyan K. Chakrabarty, sir, for being there and supporting us and for your bestowed words. Thank you so much, sir. Thirdly, to Dr. Rajendra Channi for being the motive and reason behind this webinar. Thank you, sir. I thank Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kuvanpu University for being there with us and supporting us and for his beautiful message. Thank you so much, sir. And I thank Manasa Trust for its greatest support as always, and Dr. Sandhya Kaveri for being the strength to make this webinar possible. Thank you, madam. I thank Sister Mari Evelyn, Coordinator MSc Psychology, Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College, for being a constant guide. Thank you, sister. I thank all the delegates for joining us and being part of this webinar. Thanks again. I thank all my colleagues and non-teaching staffs of Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College and students too for their constant support. Thank you one and all. The link of the feedback form has been put up in the chat box. All the delegates will have to fill it up to get the e-certification. Signing off, this is Vidha Dongre, lecturer in the Department of Journalism, Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College. Have a good day. You may kindly leave the meeting. Thank you.